What if I told you that the main battle of a Roman legionnaire was not with the enemy, but with his own equipment and daily routine? We are used to seeing Roman soldiers as invincible warriors in shining armor. But we never think about the price of this image. The real life of a legionnaire consisted of continuous physical labor, iron discipline, and psychological pressure, next to which the battle itself could seem like a relief. It was a world where survival depended not on bravery, but on endurance and the ability to obey. We will immerse ourselves in 24 hours in the life of this soldier on the march, in field conditions, and you will understand why most of us would not last a day. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn why a camp built in 3 hours was more terrifying than any sword, and what one drink allowed survival in inhuman conditions. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Roman army. Its strength lay not in swords, but in a trumpet. A legionnaire's day began long before dawn, in complete darkness, with the piercing and sharp sound of a trumpet, a tuba. This signal was not melodious. It was designed to pierce the ears, instantly rousing thousands of people from sleep at once. For a soldier, this sound marked the beginning of another day of hard labor and absolute obedience. There was no time for a slow awakening, no time to come to one's senses. The signal meant immediate action. A legionnaire's sleep was short, restless, and cold. Soldiers slept 8 to a cramped leather tent called a contubernium, right on the ground, with only their cloaks for bedding. The cold seeped in from below, and the air inside the tent was stuffy and heavy. Waking up was a shock to the body, an instant transition from fragile warmth to the dampness and chilly air of the morning. The first movement was not to stretch, but to grab the shoes and equipment that lay nearby. Immediately after the signal, the camp exploded with thousands of muffled sounds. There were no shouts or conversations, only the business-like bustle of thousands of people acting as a single mechanism. Everyone knew their task, honed to perfection by months of drill. The tents had to be taken down, personal belongings packed away, and equipment prepared for inspection. There was practically no time for personal hygiene, which was reduced to a quick wash with ice-cold water from a communal barrel. This morning rush defined the very essence of the Legion. It was not a group of individuals, but a living machine. Each soldier was a cog, and the failure of one cog could slow down the entire system. Being late, having unready equipment, or failing to perform morning duties was punished immediately and severely. The centurion, the commander of the 100, was already standing outside watching his men with impartial attention. The first task was to take down the contubernium tent. 8 men had to work together to fold the heavy leather sheets and secure them on the back of one of the mules assigned to their group. This mule also carried a communal hand mill for grain, cooking pots, and provisions for several days. The loss or damage of this common property was a serious offense. Every minute was scheduled, and in half an hour, the camp had to transform from a sleeping town into a column ready to march. While the soldiers were packing up the tents, other legionnaires performed other duties. The buglers and standard bearers were already standing by the centurion's tent, ready to relay further signals. The furnariari, responsible for supplies, checked the grain and fodder reserves. The entire camp moved in a strict, almost ritualistic rhythm, honed over decades and even centuries. This was the first and most important lesson of the day. Personal needs meant nothing. Only the functioning of the Legion mattered. In the pre-dawn gloom, the soldiers felt the weight of the day ahead for the first time. A march of many kilometers lay ahead, and possibly construction work or even battle. But for now, the main task was simply to get ready on time. This first hour of the day was a test of discipline, a test of how deeply the Army's code of conduct had penetrated the consciousness of each individual. The Roman army began its day not with prayer, but with action. After the tents were packed up, it was time for morning breakfast. This word had nothing to do with our idea of it. The soldiers ate a piece of dry bread, panis militaris, which they had prepared the day before. It was a hard, unleavened flatbread that required strong teeth. It was washed down with a sip of water or a drink diluted with vinegar, which we will discuss later. This meager meal was not for pleasure, but solely for fuel. The body received the minimum necessary to get moving. There was never any hot food in the morning. Lighting thousands of fires would have exposed the camp and taken up precious time. Soldiers were trained to be content with little and to perform at their best from the very morning. When the first rays of the sun barely touched the horizon, the second bugle call sounded. It signaled complete readiness to march. By this time, every legionnaire was already standing in full battle gear, with a heavy Sarsina backpack on his shoulders, a shield in his hand, and spears. The weight of the equipment was already pressing on their shoulders, and the day was just beginning. Does this discipline seem excessive or justified to you? We are very interested in hearing your point of view, so please write about it in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new facts about the Roman military machine. Are you ready to learn the truth about how much a Roman soldier actually weighed? The process of putting on armor was not a quick task, but a daily ritual that required the help of comrades. First, the legionnaire put on his coarse wool tunic, which was his main clothing day and night. Then a focal was tied around his neck. A scarf designed not for warmth, but to protect the skin from the relentless friction of armor and helmet. This was the first precaution against blisters and abrasions, which could become a serious problem in the field. Over the tunic, a subermalus, or underarmor, was worn. It was a quilted jacket, similar to a gambeson, stuffed with wool or horsehair. It had two important functions. It cushioned blows and, equally important, absorbed the enormous weight of the metal armor. Without such padding, wearing armor would become an unbearable ordeal after just an hour. It also provided a little warmth on cold mornings. Then came the most famous element, the segmentata lorica. It was a complex suit of armor made of metal plates connected by straps and buckles. It consisted of several parts, shoulder pads and two halves covering the torso. A soldier could not put it on alone. He needed the help of at least one comrade from the contubernium to tighten all the straps on his back correctly. This armor provided excellent protection, but it was difficult to maintain and heavy. Each plate of this armor was a potential source of problems. Leather straps got wet from rain and sweat, and metal buckles rusted. Daily care of the lorica was as much a duty as cleaning weapons. After a march, it had to be wiped down, greased, and all fastenings checked. Such armor weighed about 9 kilograms, and this weight fell directly on the soldier's shoulders. Next came the cingulum, a wide military belt. It was not just an accessory, but a symbol of a soldier's status. It consisted of a thick leather strap decorated with metal plaques and an apron made of leather strips, also covered with metal. The belt helped redistribute the weight of the armor, transferring part of the load from the shoulders to the hips. In addition, a dagger called a pugio hung from it, and most importantly, a sword sheath was attached to it. A gladius, a short Roman sword, was attached to the right hip. It was the legionnaire's main weapon in close combat. Its location on the right was not accidental. It allowed the soldier to draw the sword without touching the large shield he held in his left hand. The sword sheath was richly decorated, but the sword itself was a purely functional, deadly instrument. A dagger called a pugio hung on the left side. It was considered a weapon of last resort or an auxiliary tool. All legionnaires carried it as part of their standard equipment. Having two blades gave the soldier confidence, although in most situations, it was the gladius that was decisive. The cingulum with all this equipment added a few more kilograms of weight. Then it was time to protect the head. The helmet, or galea, was a masterpiece of engineering. It was usually made of iron or bronze, had large cheek guards to protect the face, a wide rear visor to protect the neck, and reinforcement on the top. Inside the helmet was a leather lining for cushioning. It was heavy, hot, and made it difficult to hear, but it saved lives. The helmet was not worn constantly, but was put on immediately before battle or, when there was a threat of combat, carried on the belt. Now for footwear. Legionnaires wore caligae, the famous Roman military sandals. These were sturdy shoes made of thick leather with an open top and a strong sole studded with dozens of iron spikes. These spikes provided excellent traction and served as an additional weapon. However, Calighi did not protect against moisture, cold, or small stones. The soldiers' feet were constantly covered with calluses and abrasions, which required special care. Fully clad, the legionnaire was ready to march. But that was not all. In his left hand he carried a scutum, a huge curved rectangular shield. It weighed about 10 kilograms and was his main means of defense. In his right hand, he carried 2 spears, pilum, one heavy and one light. The total weight of all the equipment that a soldier carried, not including his backpack, already exceeded 25 kilograms. But all this equipment was useless without the most important thing: fuel for the soldier. In the next chapter, we will reveal what legionnaires actually ate and why their diet will shock you. What I am about to tell you is hidden in many films about Rome. The legionnaires' diet was extremely simple, monotonous, and completely subordinated to one goal: to provide maximum calories with minimum weight and volume. Forget about feasts and variety. The staple food was grain. Each legionnaire received a daily ration of grain, most often wheat or barley, and his main task was to turn this hard grain into edible food. Each of the 8 conscripts carried a heavy handmill. It was one of the most important items of their shared equipment. In the morning, or more often, in the evening, the soldiers took turns grinding their grain into flour. It was hard physical labor that took a lot of time and energy after an exhausting day. The quality of the grinding was poor, and the flour was coarse, with a large amount of bran. The soldiers used this flour to bake their bread, panis militaris. It was baked over an open fire, on hot stones, or on a simple metal sheet. The bread was very dense, hard, and unleavened, as yeast was a luxury. It was often baked in advance for several days. This dry bread was the staple of the diet. It had to be soaked in water or pasca to be able to chew it. Another option was pulse, a thick porridge made from the same ground wheat or barley, cooked in a common pot. This was, in fact, the only hot dish that soldiers ate regularly. Salt could be added to the porridge, if available, and sometimes a little fat for calories. This simple food was nutritious, but quickly became monotonous. It was a symbol of military life. Simple, filling, without frills. Meat was a rarity in the diet, not the rule. The legions kept herds of cattle that followed the army, but they were mainly intended for sacrifices or for the sick. Sometimes soldiers were given lardum, salted fat or bacon, which could be added to porridge or eaten with bread. It was a valuable source of fat and calories, especially in cold regions. Hunting during marches was usually prohibited so as not to disrupt the order and expose the column. Cheese, huas cassis, was much more common in the diet. Hard, salty cheese was the perfect food for the army. It was high in calories, light, and could be stored for a very long time without spoiling. A piece of cheese with bread often made up a legionnaire's lunch on the march. It was a simple but effective food that allowed them to quickly regain their strength during a short rest. Vegetables and fruits were a situational addition. If the army passed through a loyal province, it was possible to buy or requisition olives, beans, garlic, or onions. They were added to porridge for flavor. In wild areas, soldiers could gather edible roots and berries if the centurion allowed it, but you couldn't count on that. Grain always remained the staple. But what if I told you that the main secret to endurance was not bread, but a drink? Every soldier carried a flask not with water, but with pasca. It was a drink made from water with sour vinegar added to it. It sounds unappetizing, but this drink had 3 important advantages. First, the vinegar disinfected the water, which was critical during a campaign. Second, it was excellent for quenching thirst. Third, it was cheap and readily available. Clean water was a problem. Soldiers took it from rivers, lakes, and wells along the way. The quality of this water was questionable, and drinking it raw could lead to diseases that decimated the army faster than the enemy. The vinegar in pasca was the simplest and most effective means of disinfection. Soldiers were required to drink pasca rather than clean water. This diet was designed for endurance, not strength. A grain-based diet rich in carbohydrates provided a steady supply of energy needed for long marches and construction work. A Roman legionnaire was more of a marathon runner than a sprinter. His body was trained to function on this monotonous but reliable fuel. If you appreciate such unusual insights into history, be sure to like this video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos on the history of ancient Rome. Guess how many kilometers a legionnaire had to walk per day while carrying the weight of another person? After a meager breakfast and roll call, the signal to march sounded. The most grueling part of the day began. The legionnaire carried not only the armor and weapons we talked about. On his shoulders lay the sarcina, a huge backpack, which was a heavy burden in itself. It was not a backpack in the modern sense, but a T-shaped pole on which the soldier carried all his belongings. The sarcina contained everything necessary for survival. There was a leather bag with personal items, a spare tunic, socks, and a raincoat called a sagum. There was also a 3-day supply of grain. In addition, each soldier carried kitchen utensils, a pot called a patera, a flask for pasca, and a mug. But that was not all. The heaviest part of the sarcina was the tools. Each legionnaire carried a tool for building a camp, a shovel, a pickaxe, or an axe. In addition, he carried 2 heavy, pointed stakes, valli, which in the evening were turned into a palisade for the camp rampart. The weight of the sarcina alone could reach 20 kilograms. The total weight that a legionnaire carried on his back, armor, weapons, shield, spears, and sarcina, ranged from 35 to 45 kilograms. This is the weight of a modern teenager or a full set of special forces equipment. And with this weight, the legionnaire had to not just walk, but march in formation, maintaining a strict pace for many hours. This was the daily norm. The army moved in a marching column, or agmen. It was not just a crowd, but a clearly organized structure. The scouts and vanguard marched in front. Then came the wagons with tents and heavy equipment. Behind them marched the legions, each in its own order, with banners and officers. The column stretched for many kilometers, and its movement was slow but inexorable. The Roman army knew 2 marching speeds. The normal speed, gradus militaris, was about 20 Roman miles, or 30 kilometers, in 5 summer hours. An accelerated march could reach 36 kilometers in the same time. The norm was to walk 30 kilometers before lunch, take a break, and then walk some more if necessary. And all this with full equipment. Moving in a column was psychologically exhausting. The soldier saw only the back of his comrade's head and his swaying sarcina. He had to keep his distance, not fall behind and not run ahead. Any violation of order was immediately suppressed by the centurion, who walked along the column with his famous vetus, a stick made of grapevine. This stick was often used to maintain discipline. Monotony was the main enemy. Hour after hour, the soldier heard only the rhythmic pounding of thousands of feet in caligae, the creaking of leather straps, and the clanking of equipment. Talking in formation was forbidden. Soldiers were left alone with their thoughts, sore shoulders, and aching feet. Dust kicked up by thousands of feet clogged their noses and throats, and the sun beat down mercilessly. The footwear, caligae, was a serious challenge. Although the spikes provided good traction, the open design meant that small stones, sand, and dirt constantly got into the sandals. It was impossible to stop to shake out a stone. It would break formation. Soldiers were forced to endure, which led to terrible blisters and wounds on their feet. Foot care was an essential part of the evening routine. This march was not just a journey from point A to point B. It was a daily act of willpower, endurance training, and a demonstration of strength. The Roman army defeated its enemies even before the battle, simply by reaching them. No other army of the time could move with such speed, organization, and over such distances. What do you think was harder, carrying the load or keeping up the pace? In the next chapter, we'll find out what happened when the march finally stopped. After 5 hours of continuous marching, when the sun was at its zenith, a trumpet sounded, announcing a rest. This sound was perhaps the most welcome of the whole day. The column stopped, but this did not mean a chaotic rest. Discipline was maintained even during the break. The legionnaires sat down on the ground right where they stood along the road. They were allowed to take off their heavy sarcina, which was a huge relief for their worn-out shoulders. It was not a lunch, but rather a short snack. The soldiers took out the supplies they had brought with them. Most often it was the same piece of panis militaris they had eaten in the morning, or a little hard cheese. There was no hot food in sight, Building fires would have taken too long and posed a security risk. The purpose of the rest stop was not to eat, but to quickly replenish energy and give their legs a rest. The main task during the rest stop was to quench their thirst. The soldiers drank paska from their flasks. A sip of the sour, cool liquid washed away the dust and brought great relief. Officers and centurions strictly monitored water consumption, especially in arid regions. Every soldier knew his ration and understood that his survival depended on the rational use of supplies. The rest stop did not last long, usually no more than an hour. This time was used not only for eating. Soldiers used these precious minutes to take care of themselves and their equipment. First, they examined their feet, taking off their caligy, shaking out any stones, and checking for new blisters or abrasions was vitally important. If a small wound was not treated, by evening it could turn into a serious problem, rendering the soldier unfit for combat. They also checked their equipment. They had to make sure that the straps of their lorica were not loose, that the buckles on their sarcina were secure, and that their weapons were in place and had not been damaged during the march. Any minor damage that went unnoticed now could be fatal in battle or simply lead to the loss of a valuable item. Soldiers helped each other, examining backs and fastening that they could not reach themselves. While the infantry rested, other parts of the army worked. Scouts, or exploradors, returned to the legate and reported on the situation ahead. They reported on the availability of water sources, convenient places to spend the night, or signs of enemy presence. Engineers, or immunes, could inspect bridges or difficult sections of road that the army would have to cross. The army was not just resting, it was preparing for the next stage of the journey. Despite their fatigue, they could not completely relax. The legion was in enemy or potentially hostile territory. Shields and spears were always at hand. Special detachments stood guard around the perimeter of the stationary column, observing the surrounding area. Any suspicious noise or movement immediately put everyone on alert. A legionnaire's rest was always tense. This short hour was a psychological respite. Soldiers could exchange a few words with their comrades in the contubernum, but more often than not, they just sat silently, conserving their strength. The monotonous march was exhausting, not only physically, but also mentally. Any opportunity to just sit and not move was worth its weight in gold. However, every soldier knew that this rest would soon be over. Centurions walked among their men, checking on their condition. They were experienced veterans and could tell by the look of a soldier how tired he was or whether he had any problems. The combat effectiveness of the entire centuria depended on their attention. They could order a soldier to redistribute his load or help him with his straps. They were not just commanders, but also strict mentors. The bugle call to fall in again always sounded too early. The soldiers rose with a heavy sigh, hoisting the hated sarcina back onto their shoulders. The muscle pain, which had subsided in an hour, returned with renewed vigor. The legionnaires lined up in their column, and the monotonous, exhausting march resumed. There were still several hours to go before they reached their night's lodging. What if I told you that the most formidable Roman legion was actually a construction battalion? In the afternoon, after covering the planned distance, the army stopped for the night. But that did not mean rest. The most important, non-labor-intensive ritual of the Roman army began: the construction of a fortified camp, or castrum. The Roman army never, under any circumstances, spent the night in the open field. Every evening, it built a new fortress from scratch. The location for the camp was chosen in advance by engineers and scouts. It had to be on high ground, with a good view, access to water, and, if possible, protected on one or two sides by natural barriers. As soon as the column arrived, the engineers marked out the ground using a gromi, a special surveying instrument. They marked the corners of the camp, the main streets, and the place for the commander's tent with pegs. Then the incredible coordinated work began. The legions were divided into groups. One part of the soldiers, without removing their armor, stood in battle formation, facing the field, ready to repel any sudden attack. The second, larger part immediately took up the tools they had been carrying all day. Construction began. It was a race against time. The camp had to be ready before sunset. The first task was to dig a trench, or fossa. Thousands of legionnaires dug into the ground with shovels and pickaxes. The trench was dug around the entire perimeter of the future camp. It was deep, often up to 3 meters, and V-shaped to make it difficult to climb down and up. All the excavated earth was not scattered, but neatly stacked on the inside of the ditch. This earth was used to form a rampart, or agger. The soldiers trampled the earth, creating a high embankment that served as the foundation for the wall. The rampart could reach a height of 2 to 3 meters. It was exhausting work that required enormous physical effort. Soldiers who had just marched 30 kilometers were now forced to swing shovels for hours, moving tons of earth. While some dug the trench and piled up the embankment, others worked on the palisade. Remember those 2 stakes, valley, that each legionnaire carried in his sarcina? Now was their time to shine. These stakes had been specially treated. They were sharpened at both ends and had knots in the middle to make them difficult to pull out. Thousands of these stakes were driven into the top of the rampart, creating an impenetrable, splintery palisade. The speed of this work was astonishing. The entire legion, about 5,000 men, worked as a single, well-oiled machine. Everyone knew their maneuver, their place, and their task. The centurions pushed those who lagged behind, keeping an eye on the pace of work. As a result, in just 2 or 3 hours, a full-fledged fortress capable of withstanding a serious siege grew out of nowhere. Inside the camp, while the fortifications were being built, other soldiers were already setting up tents. The layout was standard. The camp was always rectangular in shape with 2 main streets intersecting in the center. Each cohort, each centuria, and each contubernium knew its exact location. The soldiers pitched their leather tents in strict rows, creating streets and neighborhoods. This standardized plan was a brilliant solution. Wherever the army went, soldiers always knew where their tent was, where the centurion's tent was, and where the commander's headquarters were. They did not need to spend time orienting themselves in a new place. They were always in familiar surroundings, which gave them a huge psychological advantage and confidence. By the time the sun began to set, the camp was ready. The gates were locked and guards were posted on the ramparts. Only now, inside the secure perimeter, could the combat guards lay down their weapons and join their comrades. The work that began at 4 in the morning came to an end only after 12 hours of hard labor. What aspect of camp life do you find most difficult? In the next chapter, we will look inside the tents and learn about the soldiers' evening routine. Once the camp was set up and the guards were in place, the legionnaires finally had some free time. But even that was filled with stuff they had to do. First, they had to take care of their equipment on which their lives depended. The armor that the soldiers wore all day was covered with dust, dirt, and sweat. It had to be taken off, cleaned, and prepared for the next day. The soldiers sat down by their tents and began methodical cleaning. The metal plates of the lorica were wiped with a cloth and greased to protect them from rust. Leather straps were checked for cracks and abrasions. Any damaged strap was immediately repaired or replaced. It was tedious and dirty work, but absolutely necessary. Weapons also required attention. The gladius and pilum had to be cleaned, and if necessary, sharpened. Then it was time for the main meal of the day. Soldiers from the same contubernia gathered together at their tent. They took out the grain they had received in the morning and began to grind it with a hand mill. This was a collective responsibility. While some ground the grain, others built a small fire and brought water. The fire was built very carefully in small pits so that the smoke would not be too noticeable. They prepared dinner from the freshly ground flour. Most often it was the same pools that we have already mentioned, a thick barley or wheat porridge. It was cooked in a common bronze pot. Salt was added to the porridge and, if they were lucky, a little fat, cheese, or dried vegetables. After a whole day of hunger and hard work, this simple hot meal seemed like a real feast. The soldiers ate straight from the pots, using wooden spoons or just pieces of bread. During dinner, the soldiers had a chance to socialize. The contubernium was like a second family to a legionnaire. These 8 men lived, ate, slept, and fought side by side for many years. They knew everything about each other and trusted each other with their lives. The evening meal was a time to discuss the day's events, share quiet jokes, and maintain morale. These moments of camaraderie were critical for psychological relief. After dinner, it was time to take care of themselves. Soldiers examined their feet, washing away calluses and abrasions sustained while marching in their sandals. They washed their tunics if possible, or at least dried them by the fire. Personal hygiene was primitive but vital to preventing health problems. Each soldier was his own doctor and tailor. They also had to repair their equipment. A torn sandal strap, a hole in a cloak, a loose fastening on a shield. All of this required immediate attention. Soldiers carried a set of simple tools, an awl, needles, and strong thread. The ability to repair one's own equipment was as important a skill as sword fighting. The army could not afford to lose soldiers over such trifles. When all the work was done, the soldiers had perhaps half an hour left before lights out. Everyone used this time in their own way. Some simply sat by the dying fire, staring into the flames. Others wrote letters home using wax tablets and styluses. Some played dice, even though gambling was officially prohibited, but the officers often turned a blind eye to it. It was a fragile moment of personal peace before the new night. The camp gradually quieted down. The sounds of thousands of people cleaning their weapons and preparing food were replaced by the quiet hum of conversation. Officers held evening meetings. Centurions walked around their sentries, checking that everything was in order. With the onset of complete darkness, life in the camp came to a standstill, except for one important part: guard duty. The soldier went to sleep in his tent, sharing the cramped space with 7 comrades. He lay down on the hard ground, covered with a cloak, in the same clothes he had worn all day. Sleep was shallow, as many knew they would have to get up again that night. For a legionnaire, the day did not end at sunset. It flowed smoothly into a night full of its own duties and anxieties. As darkness fell, the camp fell asleep, but not into silence. The safety of thousands of sleeping people depended on the vigilance of their comrades. The night was divided into 4 watches, or vigils, each lasting about 3 hours. Every night, about a quarter of the legion did not sleep but stood guard. It was an exhausting duty that fell to each soldier in turn. The tesserarius was responsible for the night watch in the centuria. This junior officer received a tessera from the command, a wooden tablet on which the password for the day was written. His task was to go around all the posts of his centuria and make sure that every sentry knew the password. He was also responsible for changing the guard on time, waking up the sleeping soldiers for their vigilia. Serving on the rampart was a difficult ordeal. The sentry stood in full gear, including armor and helmet. He had to stand motionless, peering into the darkness outside the camp and listening to every rustle. It was a battle against the cold, fatigue, and sleep. Falling asleep on duty was one of the most serious military crimes, punishable very severely, even by death. The sentries did not stand only on the ramparts. Patrols walked the main streets of the camp, maintaining order and silence. They checked that the fires were extinguished and that there were no strangers in the camp. Special posts were set up at the commander's tent, the legion's banners, and the gates. The entire camp was under constant surveillance. There was a whole system in place to check the vigilance of the sentries. At night, special patrols consisting of horsemen rode through the camp. They approached the post suddenly and demanded the password. If the sentry hesitated, fell asleep, or could not give the password, he was immediately arrested. This constant threat of inspection kept the soldiers in incredible tension. Psychologically, night watch was very difficult. Monotony, darkness, and silence heightened the senses. Every crack of a branch, every cry of a night bird seemed like an alarm signal. The soldier had to fight not only the real enemy that could be hiding in the darkness, but also his own imagination, which painted dangers at every turn. 3 hours on guard duty seemed to last forever. The cold penetrated to the bone, and the weight of the armor pressed down on his shoulders. His only desire was to return to his tent and go to sleep. But the soldier stood his ground because he knew that the lives of his comrades depended on his vigilance. This collective responsibility was instilled in the legionnaires at an instinctive level. The changing of the guard was the only event that broke the monotony of the night. The tesserarius arrived with a new group of soldiers. The old guard passed the password to the new one, reported that the night had passed quietly, and only then was he allowed to go and rest. The soldier who had stood his vigil returned to his tent and fell into his place, trying to snatch an hour or 2 of sleep before the general wake-up call. Midnight was the middle of the night, the time of deepest darkness and deepest silence. For the soldier who did not have to stand guard, it was the time of the most restless sleep. Conditions in the tent were far from comfortable. 8 adult men lay shoulder to shoulder in a space barely large enough for 4. It was almost impossible to turn over without disturbing a neighbor. They slept directly on the ground, covered at best with a raincoat. The ground was hard and cold, and by the middle of the night, the cold penetrated through. The leather tent did not protect from dampness, and if it rained, it became wet and dirty inside. The soldiers slept in their clothes to keep warm, ready to jump up at any moment if the alarm sounded. The sounds of the camp prevented them from falling completely asleep. Outside, they could hear the footsteps of patrols on the gravel and the shouts of sentries demanding passwords. The snorting and restless movement of hundreds of mules and horses tied nearby also did not contribute to the silence. Added to this were the sounds from inside the tent itself: snoring, coughing, and the muttering of comrades in their sleep. The psychological tension did not let up even in sleep. Every soldier knew that he was in enemy territory, protected only by a moat and a palisade that they themselves had built a few hours earlier. Any loud noise, any cry could mean a night attack. This constant subconscious anxiety made sleep shallow and intermittent. Even when there was no external threat, there were other discomforts. In the cramped tent, smells quickly spread: sweat, dirty clothes, unwashed shoes, garlic from dinner. The air was stifling. It was the downside of the very collective life that saved them during the day. At night, it became a test. Sometimes sleep was interrupted by an alarm. It could be a false alarm caused by wild animals or a real enemy attack. At the sound of the bugle, the entire camp had to jump up in a matter of seconds. In the darkness, the soldiers grabbed their weapons and shields, ran out of their tents, and took their places on the ramparts, ready for battle. After the alarm was canceled, it was very difficult to fall asleep again. Their bodies, exhausted from the day's march and construction work, desperately needed rest. But their brains could not completely shut down. Soldiers did not sleep like civilians. Their sleep was more a state of reduced alertness than full recovery. They existed in a state of permanent fatigue. Those who had to do the third or fourth vigil couldn't sleep properly at all. They lay there, knowing they would soon be woken up, and this fitful sleep brought no relief. They got up at 2 or 3 in the morning to go out into the cold darkness and take their posts. And after their shift, they had no more than an hour before the general wake-up call. 3 o'clock in the morning was the deadest point of the day. It was the darkest and coldest time, when dawn was still far away and the night seemed endless. For a soldier sleeping in a tent, these were the last minutes of relative peace. For a sentry on the rampart, these were the hardest minutes of his watch. The body tuned into sleep resisted desperately, and the struggle against sleep required all his willpower. This hour was a time of silence. The camp fell silent. Even the animals stopped making noise. Only the roll call of the sentries on the ramparts and the footsteps of the patrols could be heard. This silence was deceptive. It was filled with tense anticipation. The soldiers knew that dawn was the favorite time for surprise attacks and were ready for it. In the tents, sleep was deepest but also most restless. Bodies, cramped from the cold, tried to retain heat. The soldiers lay huddled together, sharing the warmth of their bodies. It was not the closeness of friendship, but the harsh necessity of survival. Many woke up from the cold and simply lay in the darkness, waiting for the bugle call. It was a time for reflection. In the silence of the night, when there was no work, no marching, no centurion's commands, the soldier was left alone with himself. He thought about home, about the family he had left far behind. They recalled past battles and thought about future ones. It was the only time when the harsh army machine loosened its grip, allowing personalities to emerge. If the army was facing battle rather than a march, this night was completely different. The soldiers did not sleep but prepared themselves. They checked their weapons with particular care, wrote their wills on wax tablets, and made vows to the gods. The air in the camp was electrified with tension, a mixture of fear and excitement. But in our case, it was just another night in a long, endless march. An hour before the bugle call, the camp was already beginning to wake up. The Tesserae woke the soldiers for the last, fourth vigil. The cooks in charge of supplies began to check the grain reserves and prepare for the morning ration distribution. Life in the camp began to slowly smolder, preparing to burst into flames with the first sound of the trumpet. The soldier, who had woken up a few minutes before the signal, lay and listened. He listened to the silence, knowing that it was about to explode with a command. This moment of anticipation was perhaps the hardest of the whole day. It meant that the cycle was beginning again. Again, waking up in the dark, again putting on heavy armor, again a 30-kilometer march, and again building a camp. This endless cycle was the real life of a legionnaire, not the heroic battles that happened a few times a year, but the daily, monotonous, exhausting work. This work turned ordinary farmers and craftsmen into the most enduring and disciplined soldiers in the world. It was the foundation of Rome's power. We have gone through a full 24-hour cycle in the life of a Roman legionnaire on campaign. As you can see, this day was filled not so much with battles as with exhausting labor, strict discipline, and a constant struggle with deprivation. Waking up at 4 in the morning, marching for many kilometers under a load of 40 kilograms, building an entire fortress in 3 hours, and sleeping restlessly in a cramped tent. This is the true face of military service. What aspect of a Roman soldier's life impressed you the most? The weight of the sarcina, building a camp every evening, or perhaps the diet of grain and vinegar? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new immersions into the harsh reality of history.